once again to 5.1% in July from 4.6% in June. According to data from Statistics South Africa, transport costs were the key contributors due to higher fuel prices. Fuel prices have been steadily increasing since April due to a combination of higher global oil prices, higher fuel taxes and a weakening rand. On a monthly basis, inflation rose to 0.8% in July from 0.4% in June. Core inflation, which excludes the prices of food, non-alcoholic beverages, petrol and energy, also rose to 4.3% year-on-year from 4.2%. This has prompted government to investigate strategies aimed at cushioning consumers from the impact.
Consumers have had their disposable incomes eroded in recent months due to higher tax rates. We saw the 1 percentage point increase in the VAT rates in April. There's been higher fuel prices and inflation edging upwards. It's all playing a role in eroding disposable incomes.
Economic freedom fighters have in the past week introduced a bill to Parliament that seeks to nationalise the Reserve Bank. If it's passed, this will make the state the sole owner of the shares in the bank. Reserve Bank Governor Lesetja Kganyago has said in media interviews that the central bank will do everything in its power to protect its independence, but has also said that the bank will cooperate with all governmental and parliamentary processes tasked to look at options to nationalise the bank. Kganyago says the move would be costly and poses a risk to the economy. The African National Congress also resolved at its conference in December to nationalise the Reserve Bank, saying the current ownership structure was a historical anomaly. To take this further, we are joined in studio by Professor Jannie Rossouw. He's the head of School of Economics and Business Science at Wits University, an accountant and analyst, Khaya Sithole. Thanks so much both for your time. Khaya, I'll start with you. You've said it makes no difference whether this bank is nationalised or private.
Yeah, so essentially what we have here, it's a question of shareholding. And what we have in this South African Reserve Bank is that there are private shareholders, around 660 of them, who own the 2 million shares that exist within the bank. But unfortunately, the way that shareholding has been structured is that the powers that would ordinarily be associated with shareholding do not exist in this particular context, because everything that really matters in relation to the bank, which is really the question of how it conducts its affairs, is completely governed by the state through the governor and the board of governors. So in this particular instance, it really doesn't seem that there will be a material difference in the operations of the bank, whether there were private shareholders or not. But I suspect here, of course, what we need to acknowledge is that the concept and the essence of nationalization is fundamental to the EFF's DNA. So for them, anything that can be seen as an opportunity to remove private shareholders or private ownership in favor of state ownership is something that they're always going to go for. I do think that even they are aware that there will not be a material difference if you change their shareholding. Now, that is based on us assuming that that is really what they are after. If, of course, they've got a bigger goal, which is to say, once perhaps the state is the sole custodian and the finance minister is in charge of everything, then it will be easier to then do particular things. Then that's a secondary conversation. But we're assuming that this is what they're telling us is really what they want right now.
Professor, we've been using the word nationalise a lot, and you've said we must use expropriation. Just take us through that.
Now, in this instance, although this bill is introduced as the nationalisation of the Reserve Bank, it's actually expropriation without compensation of the shares currently held by the public in the South African Reserve Bank. The bill makes no provision for any compensation for the shareholders and states very clearly in its explanatory memorandum that the financial implications to the government, to the state, will be none. So this is introducing the principle of expropriation without compensation into debate in South Africa in a parliamentary context for the first time. So this is really at the heart of the matter, expropriation without compensation.
If that is at the heart of the matter, how is it going to work constitutionally when it comes to this bill? Because the SARB's mandate is embodied in Section 224 of the Constitution. It must perform its functions independently. How would that work?
Look, I suppose there are two parts of the conversation. The first question is, according to the way the bill has been drafted by Julius Malema, he simply says we're going to write off the private shareholders. And of course, if you're going to write off the private shareholders and also say that there'll be zero financial consequence to the state, you are essentially saying that you're going to expropriate the shares without any form of compensation being paid. Now, the problem that we have is that in general terms, if one is to really remove one type of shareholder and replace it with another, those existing shareholders shareholders will feel that they're entitled to whatever the value of that asset is at the point at which they get removed. So in this case, if I'm an ordinary shareholder at the bank, I would say, well, if you're going to remove us today, we own 2 million shares. The 2 million shares are linked to the value of the bank, whatever that value is. Divided by 2 million shares, it means that's the value that is associated with my share. So that is what I should be entitled to. So that is what an ordinary liquidation would entail. Now, in this case, because Malema has simply bypassed that particular conversation, we suspect that it now gravitates towards saying, in terms of Section 25, if something is in the public interest, you can essentially expropriate without paying any particular compensation. Now, of course, in the bill, it doesn't even refer to Section 25. So I'm not sure if they're even aware that this is really what the conversation is about. The consequence of that is that once you've removed these private shareholders, then, of course, the question of Section 224, which is the mandate of the Reserve Bank, comes to the fore. Do you then think that once there is a finance minister who is the sole shareholder, will that minister essentially then say, oh, I think there's a problem with Section 224 and simply go and amend it? And of course, we've seen over the past 18 months, there's this newfound appetite across the country for constitutional amendments. So you suspect that once they've dealt with the question of shareholding, Section 224 is no longer sacrosanct. They will start asking questions to say, well, does Section 224 actually meet the objectives of what the state ought to do? And of course, that's when the question of that amendment might then materialize, which is probably what the Reserve Bank governor is probably more concerned about, rather than the question of this particular shareholding changing hands. I think even now, I mean, they could simply use Section 25 and say that we're not going to pay anybody, or they could go back to the latest valuation, which was done by KPMG, which said that each share is worth R1.55, so they could simply say that's what the shareholders are entitled to. Whatever that consequence becomes, it's a minor conversation compared to the Section 224 conversation, which really says, does the mandate of the Reserve Bank remain sacrosanct after you've done this particular exercise?
What would determine the fair value for the private shareholders that Khaya was speaking about now if this bill were to be passed and become a law?
Khaya has already alluded to the valuation of R1.55 per share that was placed on the shares of the Reserve Bank by KPMG in terms of shareholders who held shares above the legal limit in terms of the changed legislation. Another approach could be to use the most recent trading price of the shares at which these shares traded hands between different shareholders, which is 10 rands a share, or one can use any other equitable formula. The important point is that the South African Reserve Bank Act is silent on the valuation of the shares in the case of nationalisation. No provision is made in the Reserve Bank Act for nationalisation, and this bill by Mr. Malema is also silent on the matter.
Associate Professor Chris Malekane says that the South African Reserve Bank should be nationalised because they don't have public interest at heart. And I think one of the examples he cited was the banks and collusion. What are your thoughts on that?
Let me state that Professor Malekane is a very respected colleague of mine in the very same school at Wits. But surely, if you want Professor Malekane's views, you can ask Professor Malekane.
I'm asking you for your thoughts because we're having a conversation around the nationalisation of the Reserve Bank and what could possibly happen, and also taking a look at this appetite that Khaya was speaking about within a conversation about public interest versus private interest.
Well, in short, the big concern is that the mandate of the Reserve Bank, namely contain inflation, can be changed. And let's be honest, we've lived in South Africa for three periods of very rapid inflation. On a quarterly basis, inflation in this country has gone beyond 20% per annum. That is surely not what we need. So we must be very clear about it, that inflation is not a policy instrument, but inflation is something that must be successfully contained through monetary policy by your central bank.
So we've seen some negative market reaction when we have analysts in, when we're speaking about the issue of land expropriation without compensation, people saying they feel there's policy uncertainty. We've seen these public consultations around expropriation, and then we've also seen, before those are over, the ANC president coming out and saying this is a policy. Do you think that if the ANC agrees with this bill of Julius Malema, it doesn't actually matter about process, it's going to happen anyway?
Look, what tends to happen is that anxiety creeps in when there seems to be confusion conversation around what really ought to be done. So, for example, in the land conversation, for a very long time, the ANC was of the opinion that the constitution didn't need to be changed. They went to Nasrec and then they said that they want to do, this exploration of saying, should the constitution be changed? They had a land summit where they said the constitution doesn't need to be changed. And then they had an NEC meeting where suddenly the president said the constitution must be changed. So, of course, it's when you do not know where you stand as perhaps as an investor or as a person who's trying to really figure out what's going on in the country, that's when the anxiety kicks in, and that's when the market panic might kick in. So I think that what we tend to miss in South Africa is that our politicians tend to themselves not even know what the core issue at hand is, or even if they do know what the core issue is, they tend to struggle to articulate it in a way that sort of gets everybody to understand what it is that they're gravitating towards. So similarly here, when we talk about conversation relating to the Reserve Bank, because the ANC itself decided in Nasrec that they want the Reserve Bank to be nationalized, and then they tabled a motion in Parliament, which they withdrew the day before, it gives the impression that they themselves do not know what it is that they're trying to achieve through nationalization. So the question should be, when they made that announcement in December, what is it that they thought would be the ultimate objective that they wanted to achieve? And the fact that they then said, oh, we now need to go and consult stakeholders without explaining who those stakeholders are, really opened up the space for Julius Malema to simply say, well, there's been political vacuum that's been created by the ANC making a commitment and then retracting on it. So let me step in and do that. So what you're going to see is that, of course, the ANC will not be able to disagree with Malema's views on this particular bill. They're going to have to pass it because it is complementary to their own Nasrec resolutions. So I suspect that our role as society is to then say, okay, how can we intervene and sort of then perhaps amend or direct this bill in a manner that says, even after you've changed the shareholding, what really matters here is the question of the mandate. How do we insulate that mandate from the political forces of the day? Because really, we're now just entering into the space where the politicians are playing games with each other. And of course, as an institution like the Reserve Bank becomes a political football, and our responsibility is to sort of then say, actually, if this bill is to be passed, how do we ensure that the Reserve Bank does not become a victim of this particular exercise? And I'm not sure if society is really engaging on that yet.
Professor Rossouw, as we close, any final words on this bill?
This bill is dangerous in as much as we are talking about expropriation without compensation, and this will scare foreign investors off South Africa. And secondly, as Khaya has very well put the matter, we need to protect the constitutional mandate of the Reserve Bank to make sure that inflation is contained in the interest of all South Africans.
Jannie Rossouw and Khaya Sithole sharing their thoughts on the Reserve Bank and nationalisation. It's time for a short break. International business news coming up after that. Do stay with us.